Good morning. It's not too cold, but it's so windy, right? We were talking about how windy it was. I kept waiting for the power to go out all night long. Like little things just like kept hitting the window all night. I didn't sleep very well, right? It's like the whole night of things blowing everywhere. My cats are all cranky this morning. They all just like their fur everywhere. It's hilarious. I love it. I had another thought, but it left me. It'll come back later. So we have today, and then I won't see you next week. Remember, for Thanksgiving. I also want to remind you, and I'll write it up on the board. Don't forget that the second homework assignment is due by tonight. Mine does that too all the time. That the second homework assignment is due by tonight. So I'll write that up on the board over there. Several of you have already turned it in. So homework. So let's do on canvas. And I did it purposefully today so that you wouldn't have to worry about it over Thanksgiving. I was hoping that would give you a little bit more time next week. So hopefully you're feeling good about that. Like I said, a lot of people have already submitted it, but make sure you turn it in by tonight. If you don't get it done, you can still email it to me. You'll lose a little bit of points, but better to turn it in late than not at all. So again, all you're doing, if you haven't done it already, is picking a different option from that assignment menu. And I look forward to reading them. I think they're fun to read, probably more entertaining than some of the other assignments I give. So I hope that you've had fun with them. A lot of people have chosen things like going to the sex shops or going condom shopping and so on. And so it's fun to read your experiences. So I look forward to it. Are there any last questions or anything about the homework assignment? Anything else just to double check? Anyone going anywhere next week for Thanksgiving? Traveling at all? You're like, no way, gas is too expensive, right? I'm not going anywhere, right? Yeah, where are you going? Vegas. Oh, that's fun, right? To visit family or to do other fun things? Okay. That's fun. That's a good idea. Then you can make a fun trip out of it, right? I should do that with my family, right? Instead of having them over to our house, be like, I'll meet you in Vegas. It'd be way more fun, right? I like that idea. Anybody else? Anyone else going anywhere? I plan to eat a lot. That's my plan for the week. Lots of food, right? That's it, really. Food and extra football team. I'm looking forward to it. It's my favorite holiday, I think, other than Halloween. It's like my second favorite. All right. I will focus back in. So we'll talk about chapter 16 today. And then after we come back, we will move on. If we have a little more of 16, we'll do that. But we'll move on to then 17 and 18. We only have 3 chapters left for the semester, which is wild. So 16, what we're going to look at are varieties of sexual expression. So what is normal versus abnormal, which is incredibly subjective. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the paraphilias, right, or fetishes and things along those lines. And then a little bit about sex addiction at the end of the chapter. So I think the biggest thing to say at the beginning here is that how do we decide what is a normal sexual behavior versus an abnormal sexual behavior? I think that is something that's a really big point in this chapter. How do we decide what is normal? And this is a very, very difficult question that varies from person to person, and it can vary from relationship to relationship. What is normal to me might not be normal to you, right? What's normal to you might not be normal to a partner. What's normal today might not have been normal 10 years ago or 10 years from now, right? Everything changes quite a bit. This is something that has so much like subjectivity to it, and it can be difficult to define, right? There's an incredible amount of variety of sexual expression. People are kind of all over the spectrum with the way that they express sexuality. And again, what's normal to one person might not be normal to another. And when we're talking about things that are kind of uncommon, so if we use that word instead, or atypical, it's behavior behaviors that are typically not expressed by most people in our society. So they're not like the normal, common sexual behaviors. And sometimes we call these paraphilias. Paraphilia literally means beside love, or like on the side of love, right? So it's things that are kind of uncommon expressions of sexuality. And this, as I said, can be very difficult, right? It's hard to draw the line between things that are kind of normal activities and things that are abnormal, right? Some people enjoy like being aggressive or maybe even violent as part of sexuality, and other people would be completely turned off by that. If you find a partner who's into things that you're into, right, then it's not abnormal, right? But if you're into maybe some kind of like violence or dominance as part of sexuality and your partner's turned off by that, that's when it starts to become a problem for people. So again, very, very difficult to decide what's normal and what isn't, but paraphilias are what we would describe as kind of atypical sexual behavior. And we typically divide these up into two groups: non-coercive paraphilias and coercive paraphilias. Okay? So non-coercive are things that tend to be private acts you tend to either do alone, or they involve the participation of consenting adults. We'll talk more about consent in the next chapter, chapter 17. Talk a lot more about consent. But what we mean by consent is both people are agreeing to the behavior, right? So both people are of an appropriate age, they're both into it, they both agree to it, but things that tend to either be alone or consenting adults that agree to engage in some kind of behavior. Coercive paraphilias tend to be unwilling acts. So this involves forcing something on someone else, somebody maybe being harmed by the experience. These are often illegal. So things like pedophilia would fall into this. Any kind of like sexuality involving animals would fall into this, right? We'll talk about voyeurism, which can fall into here as well, right? So something against somebody's consent. You are watching and recording somebody without them knowing that you're doing it. That would be a coercive paraphilia. They did not agree or give their consent to that behavior. So this is a huge distinction. The non-coercive ones, there's nothing necessarily wrong with them. They're just kind of uncommon expressions. And again, if your partner's into it, fantastic, nothing wrong there. But the coercive ones are often illegal, they're against somebody's will, they're forced onto somebody, or maybe they just didn't give their consent to allow it to happen. So we'll talk about a few in each category. There are a ton of these. We're just going to talk about some of the more common ones that are within each of these two groups. So in the non-coercive paraphilia group, the most common thing by far are fetishes. Fetishes, a lot of people have fetishes. We could call it a fetishistic disorder. It's only a disorder if it interferes with sexuality in some way, right? Like maybe you can't achieve orgasm without it and your partner's not into that. That can be a huge issue. Fetishes are very, very common. A lot of people have some kind of fetish when it comes to sexuality. Typically, these involve non-living objects, right? So it might be like a shoe fetish or a lingerie fetish. There's so many common things: stockings, rubber, right? It could be parts of the body as well. Like maybe somebody has a foot fetish or a leg fetish or a breast fetish or whatever. It could be any part of the body, but typically somebody needs this item or part of the body in order to achieve arousal. Now, let's say that you have a foot fetish, right? That you are not able to become aroused or achieve orgasm without stimulating somebody else's feet in some way. Some of you just had like this, like, I just saw some of you like visibly grimace, right? What if your partner really loves having their feet massaged? You are super lucky then, right? You can massage their feet, they're happy, you're happy, everyone's happy, not a problem. But if your partner isn't into their feet being touched, especially potentially in some kind of sexual context, that's when it starts to become an issue, right? And again, fetishes are very common. It's just to add another layer of complexity. It's relatively common that people who have a fetish, especially an intense one, might work in an area that allows them to indulge that in some way. So people who sell shoes are very likely to have foot fetishes, right? Just next time you're buying a pair of shoes, you can look at that person slightly differently, maybe, maybe not, right? It's relatively common that fetish seek jobs that allow them to indulge that, or at least be around it in some way. Not always, but it is kind of a common correlation that we see. I also, I have a little video that talks about these just a little bit. It's this young woman who does all of these kind of like pop culture clips, and she balances like a flippancy with knowledge that I think is kind of a good balance. So I'll play it for you. She talks about what fetishes are, how they're formed, flippancy at the same time. But what is, I think, helpful about that is talking about the difference between a preference and a fetish, right? A lot of people have preferences, right? You like certain things to be present or to happen in order to be aroused or achieve orgasm. You need that to happen if you have a fetishistic like disorder or a fetishistic preference. So for example, like leather, rubber, right? Lingerie, those are all very, very common items that people have fetishes around, and you're not able to achieve arousal without them. Or it could be a part of the body, as she mentioned as well. Very commonly formed through conditioning. You have an experience that happens where you are aroused and there was an item present and they become connected, right? Like Pavlov with his ringing the bell and the dog salivating, right? They become connected through classical conditioning. And all of a sudden you have this arousal response to an item, right? So it's very, very common that that's how these are formed. And they can be, again, objects, or it can be parts of the body. Traditionally, we say objects, but they can be extended to parts of the body as well. Probably the most common of the non-coercive paraphilias having some kind of fetishistic preference. There is a very specific kind of type of fetishism called transvestic fetishism, sometimes called transvestic disorder. This is a confusing one because we hear the word trans, or like transgender, transsexual, whatever, might follow the trans. And we tend to think of like opposite gender, opposite sexuality. There's an element of that here, but this is very specific. This is someone who derives sexual arousal from wearing clothing of the opposite sex. So this isn't somebody who is like a drag queen or a drag king who wears clothing just as like a performance. This isn't the same as somebody who wears opposite sex clothing to feel whole or to feel like their gender identity is matching. This is very specific to someone who is maybe using one piece of clothing of the opposite sex to achieve arousal. So maybe a man wearing women's underwear, or a woman wearing like men's boxers, right? It's like a specific item that they would use typically to masturbate with and achieve some kind of arousal. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. We're assuming the opposite sex clothing, right? Which is kind of a difficult one to define the more kind of liberal we get with clothing. But the idea is that you use some kind of item to achieve sexual arousal. And it's typically something that maybe you have borrowed or stolen, or maybe you've purchased, right? From another person. It's often a lot of shame associated with this, but it is relatively common. It's one of the more common fetishes, using some specific item from typically the opposite sex to achieve arousal, typically a piece of clothing. Any questions or thoughts or comments or anything for the moment before I keep going? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but that doesn't fit really. It's
No.
not it's disassociative.
Yeah, right. It's
But it
interesting
reminds-
though. Yeah, because whenever he becomes aroused, right, in any
Yeah.
way, he transitions to his mom, right? It's very much like a dissociative identity disorder where he becomes a version of his mother. But I can see your connection. It doesn't quite fit, but it reminds me of it too. Yeah, yeah, there is kind of an element of that to it, but it's much more like dissociative identity. I love that show, Bates Motel. I don't know if any of you watched that. It was such a cool take on Norman Bates's character. Sad, but good. All right. Another very common non-coercive paraphilia, probably one of the more common ones in the last like 10 years because of all the 50 Shades books and movies, right? Definitely made this very popular. People who knew nothing about this topic very much becoming educated on it. I mean, I read all the books just so I would, be up with pop culture, of course, I watched the movies for the same reason, but S&M or BDSM, these behaviors typically fall into a group that we call like sadomasochistic behaviors, or BDSM, bondage, discipline, right? And then we have the S and M part, right? Sadomasochistic, right? So we often kind of put these things together as a cluster where people are enjoying either some kind of embarrassment or harm, humiliation, right? Physical elements as a part of sexuality. Now, again, if you enjoy harming or humiliating or kind of causing someone else to suffer in a sexual context, and your partner likes those things happening to them, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. In fact, like, you're probably very happy together in that like sexual context. But this can get very tricky when one person enjoys like maybe asphyxiating kind of behaviors or dominating behaviors, bondage kind of stuff, and the other person is turned off by it, right? That's where it starts to become a little bit of a problem. But sadism is when people have intense sexual arousal from fantasies or behaviors involving the physical or psychological suffering of another person. So this is inflicting it on another person, right? When someone is a sadist or engages in sadism, they enjoy dominating or causing another person to like suffer or causing them harm. There's a lot of kind of stereotypes about this, but typically people who engage in this kind of behavior have a lot of like limits that they engage in. I always think of like, there's a scene in the 50 Shades movies, right, where they have a whole contract discussion, right, of like, what are your hard limits and soft limits? What are the things you're okay with and not okay with? What is our safe word? Pineapple, right? What is the safe word, right? What is the word that you're going to use if you want me to stop? Typically, it's not no, right? It's something very specific, something that you would yell out, right, if you want your partner to stop what they're doing. There's a lot of discussion before engaging in this kind of behavior, right? So it has some stereotypes that are typically really wrong. There's not usually any kind of like permanent damage. It's a lot about dominating more than pain. Though some people do enjoy pain as part of like sexual activity. Masochism is the other side. People who enjoy being humiliated, beaten, bound, asphyxiated in some way. And then bondage is a very common element of this as well, where people like enjoy being bound or tied up or restricted in some manner. So this is a very common group of paraphilias. And again, it has become more and more common over the last like 10 years because it's something that was very much in pop culture, but a relatively common group. I used to have this guy who came in and did a presentation on this. It was so interesting and a little awkward. And I was so sad when he moved on because it was just such a like a random experience. He works at a grocery store. I see him every now and then, and like I can't like unsee some of the things that he's talked about. And I always like, I'm like, you know, every time I see him. But really interesting. This is something, again, popular, but very kind of misunderstood. Yeah. How do you mean?
So, sexual assault incidents. So both agreeing partners.
Yeah, well, so if both people agree to it, sure, right? So it could be with you're kind of bringing in like a role play and a fantasy into that as well, which is so common, right, among couples, right? Partners oftentimes will engage in like role play or fantasy like behavior. So it could be that ahead of time you set up like a situation where you're, you know, kidnapped and assaulted, and it's all within the context of this. Yeah, that's not uncommon. And sometimes, you know, people live out their fantasies with partners in that way. We're going to agree upon it. There are limits, but you know, I kind of have a little bit of this and I'd like to engage in it, right? And that's relatively common with couples to do it, for sure. There was another hand, yeah?
This isn't part of it, like for some people, like having some kind of like gag over their mouth or
Sure.
something. How would they have like a safe word or anything like that?
Right, a safe gesture, right? Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? Like if you're gagged and you can't breathe, then you can't say the word, right? Maybe that's strategic, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, then you would have probably agreed upon like behavior or gesture that you would, something that you would do, you know, as a way to get somebody to stop, right? But yeah, I mean, that is a very common element of this, the autoerotic asphyxia, it's called. Gagging people or even somewhat depriving them of oxygen. Now, this is a dangerous thing to do, but it is very common. A lot of you who went to the sex shop, somebody in here, I don't remember who it was, they asked a question about like a gag piece, like it was like this mask. Does that sound familiar to anyone? I don't know. There was a mask and they wrote about it in their paper for the last one. I mean, it's relatively common to have masks and gags and things that like cut off somebody's oxygen supply to a degree. When you're doing that, that can get dangerous. That's probably one of the more dangerous sexual behaviors. Depriving people of oxygen is obviously risky, but oftentimes some level of like choking or like I said, a gag or a belt or some kind of like compression is used as part of like BDSM behavior. But you have to be careful with that. You obviously don't want to deprive somebody too much, but some degree of that is thought to heighten like sexuality and arousal. And so it is relatively commonly used. Yeah.
So like are hospital visits that involve like BDSM like does that occur too much or usually be more careful or?
I mean, not normally. I mean, there's obviously accidents that occur. I don't know. I just thought of there's a CSI episode where the person accidentally asphyxiated their partner through this, but I mean, I wouldn't say it's relatively common by any means. People don't usually go too far. I mean, if you're paying any kind of attention, you would obviously notice, but oftentimes people will get caught up in this. They go a little too far and it can be a problem. So I think of all of the ones related to BDSM, bondage doesn't tend to be super dangerous. And a little bit of harm or like dominating somebody else isn't necessarily dangerous, but this one can, and especially if you're eliminating somebody's oxygen supply for any kind of extended time. A couple of other ones that have fallen here. These are some that are very common. Infantilism, right? So people having arousals about being treated like people having arousal and fantasies about being treated like a baby. I couldn't get that out. This one's relatively common. There was a whole documentary made about this. Typically men who enjoy wearing diapers and being treated like a baby as part of like sexual arousal. The look on some of your faces is my favorite part of this. Some of you had this look like, oh my gosh, that's awful, right? But this is a relatively common one. Traditionally, again, these tend to affect men more than women. Coprophilia or scatophagia is the other name for it. Arousal from contact with feces, right? So having somebody like defecate on you as part of like sexuality. And urophilia or urologia, it's hard to say, sorry. A person who obtains arousal from contact with urine, commonly known as water sports or golden showers. So sometimes you have to be careful. If someone asks you if you like water sports, clarify, right? Before you say yes or no. But here, these are things that are relatively common, probably some of the most common within this group, obtaining arousal from their feces or urine, being treated like a baby, involving like fire, as she talked about a little bit. There are so many of these. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. But the essence with all of these, we're still in non-coercive. You are agreeing to it. There's consent, or it's something that you're doing on your own, right? So these aren't against somebody's will. Typically, these are two people consenting to this behavior. Was that a?
Mentioned earlier that mostly it's men that have like these different fetishes.
Yeah.
Is it like across the board, like mostly men?
Yeah. It really is like almost universally. It's something, I forget the statistic, it's like 80-something% occurring in men, right? So obviously women can have these as well, but they are most common in men, right? And traditionally, one of the explanations for that is men are more likely stereotypically to masturbate than women are, or at least more commonly or more often than women are. And so oftentimes these behaviors are done as part of a masturbation routine. And so that's part of the reason why it's thought that they're more related to men. All right. Oops. The coercive paraphilias, right? I love this little meme that I found up there. I was so excited because it actually flashes, right? I was in San Francisco years ago for a conference. This was like 12 years ago, I think at this point. It was a freshman year experience conference, and I went with a bunch of colleagues. And we were walking to the conference from the hotel, and there was this guy on the corner dressed like Santa. And it was like November. It was right around now, so it didn't seem super strange. But as we walked by him, he flashed us all. I was an unwilling participant in that scenario. I did not want to see that. That's very much what exhibitionism is, right? He was standing there on the corner. He flashed anybody who came by completely naked underneath the Santa robe. Again, I was not somebody who agreed to that. That is the idea here is you have unwilling participants, people who have not given their consent. Didn't want to see that. I didn't want to see that. Got to see it anyway. Made for a memorable story. But the idea behind the coercive ones is, again, you have a lack of consent by at least one person involved. Yeah.
Common this is, because it's happened to me twice in Atypical.
Interesting. Okay.
Like signs falling, like turning off. It happened like 2 times in a row, and it was really weird. But I don't know if that's super common because it seems to happen to me a lot.
And I mean, in like big public areas, like you tend to get this more.
Yeah.
Like if you're in like mine was in downtown San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
Like you're in the downtown
Yeah,
area.
yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you need to avoid it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a more common one. Voyeurism and exhibitionism are relatively common. And people become aroused from your disgusted and shocked reaction. So the hardest thing to do here is you have to not react, right? Like you have to completely minimize their behavior, because typically what happens, somebody will expose themselves to you, and then they see your horrified, disgusted reactions, and then they masturbate to that thought later, right? That's typically what happens with this disorder. So the best way to stop this is just be like, oh, okay, keep walking, right? Like ignore it, which isn't always the easiest thing to do. Sure. Yeah.
But I was just like,
Yeah.
this seems to happen a lot.
That's really unfortunate. I'm sorry, right? But yeah, I think if you can ignore it, that tends to diffuse it. Because there are going to be people who are mortified, disgusted, and make a huge deal of it.
Well,
That's what they
the guy
want.
just keeps going.
Yeah.
The next person that crosses the street.
Right? Who's the next victim, right? Yeah, you had a thought or question? Yeah. Yes, like shaming in a way, right? You're not disgusted, but you're like, oh, how sad for you. Right? And laugh, right? Yeah, oh, right. And that would do it as well, right? And there is to a degree a little bit of that in the treatment for some of these as well, almost like a shame that goes with it as a way to stop people from doing these behaviors. But exhibitionism is pretty common, right? You're exposing yourself to somebody who did not want to see that, right? And again, it's normal to have some of these tendencies. We actually have a lot of exhibitionism in our society in general. But the idea here is that you have someone who's unwilling, right? You did not want to see that. You did not want that to happen. And so that is the nature of why it's a coercive paraphilia. This one's another variety that's also relatively common, making obscene phone calls. Right, I love this. I need a second opinion. Is this an obscene phone call or a patient with a respiratory problem? Right, calling people and saying inappropriate things, or making inappropriate comments, or masturbating on the phone. Again, the idea is that if you respond to this, right, then they're going to keep calling you, and they're going to keep doing this. So it's like, oh, I think you have the wrong number, and hang up. Right, like minimizing it as much as possible is the best way to stop both of these behaviors. But they're against your will. They're illegal. Or you can go to jail, obviously, for doing these things. It is against somebody's will and consent. Voyeurism is another one. And this one, so common, especially with cameras, right? It's very easy to record people without their knowledge. There are cameras everywhere all the time recording everything, right? And very easy to slip small cameras into spaces where people might be getting changed, like in a dressing room or in a bathroom. And that typically tends to be what we see here is you're watching somebody against their will, right? So maybe it's undressing or going to the bathroom or engaging in sex. Could be peeping through a window. It could be putting a camera somewhere. The whole article in the news, it was maybe like a year ago. A guy had a small camera he put on his shoe. And he would go close to women who were wearing dresses or skirts, and to be able to get up their skirt or dress with his camera, because he would put his foot right there, right? It's that essence of you're looking at somebody or viewing them in a way against their will, right? And this is a relatively common one, especially with how small and accessible cameras are and video cameras are, very easy to do. So you, again, it's like the risk of getting caught, right? Or the element of doing this against somebody's consent that tends to be arousing to somebody. Thoughts, questions, stories, anything here? Stories, right? That's always a, oh no, I'm just reminding you of everything that you've been exposed to. Every pun intended. Okay.
Like that.
Yeah.
And I felt like, so I don't even know how to describe it, like, I just felt so violated. I'm like in my bedroom and I like,
Yeah.
I'm worried about that. And normally nobody could be able to like look in my window, but it's because they were building up a wall. And just like the fact that they were like literally all on the wall, leaning over, looking at me, like, guys,
Yeah.
at least like try to hide it. How strong.
No effort to hide
Yeah,
whatsoever.
like, at
Right?
least- yeah, like, I don't know, I want to know that.
Yeah, and this is probably, the most common of all the like non-coercive or of the coercive ones, because it's so common, right? All those guys like looking through the window, right? Or
The audacity
yeah,
is
yeah.
what shocked me. Like
Right.
that they were like three men perched up on a fence,
Mhm.
like staring directly at.
You have way too many of these happening to you in your life.
I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So I mean, you're watching something that's been recorded. So it's not a non-coercive paraphilia, but I mean, an incredible number of people watch pornography, right? Or erotica, one or the other. And we'll talk about that in the last chapter. And so oftentimes what will happen is they'll play out these non-coercive or coercive paraphilias in the pornography, right? And so it's not against anyone's will if you purchased it and they recorded it and you're watching it. But oftentimes some of these things are played out in those films and they can be very controversial. Some of them have gone to court for, not being known whether it was consenting or not, because sometimes they make porn films that are like, they're very shady in the way that they're done, right? It's like, we're gonna engage in this whole thing of like beating, raping and assaulting you under the guise of it being consensual, but not. So in the filming of them, that's where it gets blurry, but in the watching of them, it would be like a non-coercive one. It might be that you need pornography in order to reach arousal. And if your partner's fine with that, nothing wrong with it. A lot of couples do engage in watching like porn together, right? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, because if you go back like a generation or two, pornography was stigmatized. It was really, there were so many negative like connotations around it versus I think it's much more normal now. There's also been a big change in the pornography industry over the last like 15 years. They went from like a lot of like hard porn that made people very uncomfortable to more like what they call blockbuster pornography, where they make movies like feature-length films with plot and everything, right? That also have an incredible amount of sex in them. And so there's been a big change in the pornography industry. And I think because it's more available, more easily available, than if you go back to like the 80s, it was called smut, right? And it was something that you could only get in like a back alley or like a really sketchy sex shop somewhere. So that has changed a lot as well. I think those things all together have played a really big role in normalizing it for a lot of couples and people. That's why those of you who went to sex shops, I wanted you to go to one very positive one, because there are still places that are very like, the stereotype, versus some of the ones I gave you, like the Pleasure Chest or Hustler in Hollywood, are very open, very positive, very clean. That's not the case for all of them, right? But it's definitely gone that direction much more than it used to be. Is there another hand? I want to skip you if you, is that almost a hand?
Oh, I just had another story.
Yeah, feel free. I'm
I was like, seeing this big ass bush in front of my window. It was like the middle of the night. I just got out of the shower, so I went back to my room. I was changing, and I turned around and I like made straight eye contact with some dude through the window, like standing in this bush. And he just like turned around and walked away.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't even a big deal.
Yeah, you're like, that's a big deal to me, right?
Yeah.
It's the same guy as from your story, right?
Really weird, but like come on, dude,
Sorry.
And and I'm just gonna, I don't want to never gonna see each other again.
Right. And again, and you can call the police for these things, but no, very rarely do people go that step, right? But it's very common. Unfortunately, this is a very common thing that happens. And same with the exhibitionism, like I mean, how many of you in this room have had somebody like expose themselves to you against your will, just by show of hands? But that's a good amount of you for something like that. Almost all women, right? Interestingly, right? Again, these tend to be more commonly perpetrated by men. Not always, but more commonly. Yeah.
Isn't this sort of thing like, there's like Seinfeld as well?
Is there?
There's a lot of jokes and areas where behavior is getting changed.
Okay. In Friends, right? Yeah, I was gonna say that made me think of the one, there was an episode of Friends that had that in it too, right? Yeah, I mean, it is something that pops up a lot in the media, right? And again, cameras are the big variant on this now, right? It's a lot of recording people against their will or putting things on social media, as well. One of the more serious coercive paraphilias, sadly, relatively common, but very serious, pedophilia or pedophilic disorder. This is a very tricky one. It varies from state to state, right? So every state has a different definition of how we define child. And so typically we define this as a prepubescent child. So a child before puberty would be under 13. Okay, but now puberty typically starts now around like 11 and a half to 12. So this is something that varies from state to state. But the idea is this is someone who has fantasies and arousal from children, right? So an adult, someone who is over the age of 18, that usually is becoming aroused by like fantasies of or engaging in sexuality with somebody who is a child. Now, because of their age, they are not able to give consent. Traditionally, consent cannot be given until you're 18. Now, this is very blurry when you have people who are like 16 and 17 or 17 and 15. There's all sorts of rules about like teenagers engaging in sexuality together, which are very rarely followed up on unless it's against somebody's will. But the idea is that someone who either fantasizes or touches inappropriately or engages in some kind of like pedophilic or molestation kind of behavior. Typically, this person would be, considered a sex offender or a pedophile, right? Would be the kind of common names that we might use. This is almost exclusively men, right? We tend to have this stereotype of this being like an uncle or something like that, but it can be someone that you know or don't know. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter when we talk about, lack of consent. But there is something to be aware of. There's something called Megan's Law. And I don't know if any of you have ever looked at this, but it's slightly frightening to look at. But in 1996, it became a federal law that every community has access to information about the presence of convicted sex offenders in their neighborhood. So you can go online to the Megan's Law website and look at all the sex offenders that live around you. Right. And as part of being convicted of being a, are you looking right now? Right. As part of being, sorry, pull out your phone very quickly. Right. Your neighbors in the Walder building will pop up. Right. But this is anyone who's been convicted of any kind of sex offense would be listed on the Megan's Law website. So this could be somebody who has been a pedophile, somebody who urinated in public. Right. That could count as indecent exposure and have listed on here. Somebody who, this can be a lot of different things, but they're listed on this website and you can see all of their information, what their crime was, and they're on there forever, which is a huge piece of contention, right? So if you had, let's say you were drunk and you urinated in public and you got indecent exposure when you were like 21, right? When you're 80, that will still be on there, right? And so that's something that a lot of people, there's a lot of controversy about. But you can look this up. I live right next to a school, so around me it's very, very minimal. But you can see all the little dots around where you live, which sometimes, I don't know, it makes me regret looking, but it's interesting to see anyway. Did you have a thought? Really? Yeah, and that's, yeah, you regret looking, right? I mean, it's public information, which in some ways is really good. There's an accountability there. But in other ways, it can be somewhat frightening as well. Yeah.
So when you look at what it's like kind of like a intensity, I guess, or like a how.
It's more like a profile. So it kind of looks like this, where his face is blurred out, but it has their name and information. It has the crime that they committed, and where they live, all of their information. So the idea is if you've committed a crime like this, if you're a sex offender, you are registered and everybody has that information. So you've lost that right to privacy, which most people are okay with, but the length of it lasting on there is what sometimes people have a hard time with. Like if someone makes a mistake when they're younger, should that be on there forever? Some people say yes, and some people say no, right? It's a very controversial. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I actually, we use Sightline from their, driveway of their house.
Sure.
To the guy's house. He's weird and he owns Beamer and he's like this little pen.
Yeah.
Beamer kind of walks around, loves the people driving up the road. It's so strange.
Yeah.
I've heard some stuff and stuff. I don't know how it's not. So.
Yeah, and then, I mean, too, does it change the way that you look at that individual, right? Knowing that they're on there.
Yeah.
And is that good or bad? I don't know, right? It's mixed. Again, I live on a street with an elementary school. And typically, if you are, convicted of any kind of sex offense, you can't live within a certain range of a school. And so my street, it's like clear, right? But then you go over a few miles and it's not. But it's just, having 3 little girls, I was like, all right, I should look. And it's frightening a little bit. Some of you looking like it can be a little scary to look at. Any other thoughts or anything here? We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the next chapter where we're looking at a lack of consent. But this is something that is definitely one of the more serious coercive paraphilias because of somebody's age. They cannot give consent, right? And so it is defined as coercive. A couple of other ones that are relatively common in big cities, frauderism is common, frauderistic disorder. This is really common in crowded public areas, right? Somebody rubbing up against you in a subway or on like public transportation, maybe in like a very crowded street, almost exclusively men who will sometimes take their penis out and masturbate on you against your will on a subway car, right? This is something that you're rubbing up against somebody else without their consent. And again, it's their shocked and mortified reaction that tends to cause arousal. Animals and dead people round out the list here on these, right? So zoophilia and necrophilia. Zoophilia is someone who has sexual contact with animals. Now, sometimes this is considered like a transitory experience that some young men will go through. Right now, it's not super common, but it is sometimes, it's more of a joke that oftentimes gets told. But it can be something that people will do when a sexual partner is inaccessible or unavailable or forbidden. But obviously that animal, I put this little sheep up here, right, didn't give its consent, right? And so this is considered a coercive paraphilia. Sometimes people obtaining sexual gratification by viewing or having intercourse with somebody who has passed, right? This is another one that shockingly or kind of frighteningly is relatively common within the coercive paraphilias. So, we're just talking about some of the ones that can happen. There are a million of these, but these are some of the more common ones that we sometimes see. In terms of treatment for these, it's typically a very multifaceted approach. It depends on the type of paraphilia. It depends on what's going on. People oftentimes go to therapy, right? And you're not going to go to therapy for a non-coercive paraphilia that's not causing problems. Like if you like BDSM and your partner likes that, there's no need for treatment or counseling or any kind of exploration. But if you have an intense fetish that causes you shame or embarrassment or difficulty, it might be that you go to therapy to see where that came from, right? Let's go back and analyze where that came from. Where did it start? Let's talk it through, see if we can kind of take some of the power away from it. Shame aversion, reconditioning, and satiation therapy are 3 things that we sometimes do. So there are therapists that specialize in this, that specialize in treating paraphilias and sexual like disorders and issues. Shame aversion is where you elicit strong feelings of shame. So like you were saying, laughing at somebody, right? They expose themselves and people will laugh at them. You're trying to make them feel ashamed about it so that they stop. Very common with the coercive ones. But these two are more common with like the non-coercive stuff that's causing issues. Reconditioning is where you switch. So what happens here is you switch fantasies at the moment of like orgasm to something that's more conventional. So let's say that you have a pedophilic like fantasy, right? That your fantasy is children who are very young, right? You might start masturbating to that in therapy, right? Or like as a therapeutic process, not typically in therapy, but at home as a part of therapy. Right? How awkward would that be? But at home as part of a therapeutic assignment or in a separate room. Sometimes what happens is they have you go into another room and do this and then you talk about it afterward. But you would do this and then you would switch at the last moment to something more conventional, something more appropriate. And the idea is that you're reconditioning the orgasm to something more appropriate, right? It takes some time to do. You're reconditioning, right? Kind of like things can be formed through conditioning. They can be undone that way as well. Or satiation is when you masturbate to something again and again and again and again until it loses its power. This is kind of like the theory of like, I'm going to have my kids smoke an entire pack of cigarettes so they throw up and hate smoking and never want to smoke, right? Not the best method as a side note, but it's taking the power away from you. By doing it repeatedly, it loses its appeal, right? It starts to not be so undesired. It starts to not have so much power. So there's a lot of methods that we can explore if somebody has a lot of issue around a topic or they need to change it in some way. It could be finding the root of it. It could be reconditioning it or kind of taking the power away. And again, you would only explore these things if it's causing problems or it's illegal or something like that. Yeah.
My mom did the last.
Interesting. Okay.
And was drinking, like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of the thought, right? Like you can make things like the aversion therapy, if you take away the shame piece, like if you've ever had a certain alcoholic drink and it made you sick, you typically don't want it again, right? Like when I was my first time I ever drank, I don't know why I'm going to tell you this story, right? But my first time I ever drank, I had like vodka and orange juice, right? And I got violently sick from it. I threw up like so much, right? And I hate vodka and orange juice. Like, no, thank you. Like I would rather, I don't even like orange juice that much anymore because of it. When you throw something up or have an unpleasant experience, you tend to get that aversion with it, right? Like I have a very strong chili aversion because my mother-in-law made me violently ill on chili 20 years ago, 19 years ago. I still can't eat chili as a result, right? Like my mouth waters and I feel sick. So the idea is the same, right? If we condition you to be disgusted by something that used to arouse you or be like just turned off by it, it loses its power, right? So it's a very common conditioning element in therapy and also in sex therapy as well. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, it could backfire, right? It's almost like flooding. And so it's another very common treatment where it's like you have a massive exposure to it, right? But sometimes it has the opposite effect for people, right? Like you said with vodka with was it your brother you were saying with vodka? But with the vodka example, right? He still likes it, just not as much, right? So it didn't really work in a way, right? And sometimes people like, oh, well, I smoked all those cigarettes. I still like to smoke, right? Like it doesn't necessarily always work and it can create bigger problems. Yeah.
And then it starts to bring some pain, and then because they get so used to it, they just start going
Yeah.
dark places.
It escalates.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it can definitely have the opposite effect. So if you go to see somebody, it's a lot of like discussion ahead of time. Which one's going to be the most effective, at, hopefully reducing or eliminating the issue. But there was another hand over here. Yeah. Relatively, I mean, if you go through them all the way, I would say the first one is the least effective, the shame aversion, because it can have a lot of unwanted effects. But these two, the middle one is by far the most effective. We can easily recondition people. It just takes some time, right? And you can do this with anything. I mean, if you have a preference for something that you don't like, you can recondition yourself over time, or you can make yourself like something over time, right? It's very, very easy to condition ourselves, either purposefully or sometimes even accidentally. So this one's pretty effective. The other two, maybe not quite as much.
Conditioning reminds me of that episode of Seinfeld where George eats a sandwich when he has sex,
Okay.
and then when he eats lunch the next day, he gets really turned on,
Yeah.
and he can't eat sandwiches anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, anything can become paired with sexuality, right? So very easy example, maybe it's not as wild sandwich, right? But let's say that every time before you have sex with your partner, it starts with like a back massage, right? Like your partner's massaging your back and it leads to something else. That happens enough. You become conditioned to think that back massages equal sex. You go to get a professional massage and you are ridiculously turned on through the whole thing because you're expecting that to happen. Your body is expecting that to happen. That's how fetishes are, right? Somebody massages your feet and then you end up engaging in sex. All of a sudden you associate the foot massage with arousal. And so you can recondition that. I mean, that's great with the sandwich, right? All of a sudden you're like, I'm so aroused from the sandwich and I don't know why. That kind of stuff happens. Conditioning, classical conditioning specifically, is wild that way. I mean, you'll have random reactions to things and sometimes don't even know where they came from. Have you ever had somebody walk by you that's wearing the same perfume or cologne as like someone you know? You instantly think of that other person, right? That's conditioning, right? It's very automatic. That's a great example though, right? If you ever find the clip of that, you should send it to me because that would be a funny one to show. One last thing in this chapter, sex addiction, right? Sometimes called nymphomania in women or Don Juanism in men. This involves the idea that a person can be kind of dominated by insatiable sexual needs. Now, how do you define, insatiable sexual needs? How do we know what's normal and what isn't? This is something that varies so much. When people are in a new relationship, right, when their relationship is relatively young or new, oftentimes couples will engage in a ridiculous amount of sexuality, a lot of passion, a lot of sex in the beginning of relationships. People who have been together longer, this tends to taper off a little bit, depending on the couple, depending on the people. So for some people, once a day might be normal. For other people, 5 times a day might be normal, 5 times a month, 5 times a year, right? If I were to take a poll of all of you, which I won't do, but it would be so interesting, what would you define as normal? What would be too much? And for some of you might say like once a month is not nearly enough, and others might say that's way too much, right? It depends on your age, your relationship, your health, and your level of interest. So the idea here is more than how often. It's the fact that it kind of dominates everything for you. It's the only thing you can think about. Even if you've had sex, you might want more right afterward and you're not like satisfied by it. And so it's somebody who has like a very unsatisfied level of like appetite for sex. But it's super controversial because there's no defined normal. And again, this can change quite a bit from person to person and throughout time. There's such a great example of this. I don't know if it's great, but I'm going to play it for you anyway. If you ever watched the movie Blades of Glory, there's a whole scene in there about a sex addicts meeting. And so I'm going to play it for you. And they're in a way kind of making fun of it to a degree, but there's a lot of like good pieces of kind of truths in there as well. So you'll notice that one thing that's kind of funny as well, and this is something that you see a lot in groups. So they all go to this like group therapy session. It's almost like a AANA kind of group, but for sex addiction. And oftentimes when you get groups of people together who are struggling with the same issue, it can get out of control very quickly. And you see that a little bit in here, which I think is very realistic. Like if you get a group of people together who are all struggling with anger, right? Not uncommon for things to get escalated. Group of people struggling with sex addiction, not uncommon for them to try and hook up with each other. And so you'll see that as well. Let me pause this. struggle with, right? And it can be a problem when, let's say that your sex drive means that you want sex like every day and your partner wants to have sex once a week or once every couple of weeks, right? Oftentimes this can lead to problems for people. They might end up engaging in like cheating on a partner because they can't control their sex drive, or it's all they can think about, right? They're so distracted by like that sex drive and urge for like having sex. And so this can be a very difficult thing that people struggle with. There's a couple of actors who have come out and talked about this and the struggle that they've had with it. But again, controversial. How do we define what is too much? There isn't really like a universal definition for that. So just kind of one last thought here in this chapter. And then where we'll go next when I see you, not next week, because I won't see you next week. When we come back, we'll look at power and sexual coercion and then selling sex. So chapter 17 and 18. And I wanted to really quickly, since we have a couple of minutes, if you're on our course website, right? So on our human sexuality Canvas link, the assignment. So just really quickly right here, if you click on assignments on the left, this is where you'll find the link for assignment number 2. So just to make sure you know where that is, if you didn't already. And if you click on this, it will give you, all of the options. Here's the menu that you can look at and the instructions and everything on that. So just make sure that you're doing this. If you haven't already submitted it, it's due by night at 11:59 p.m. And you can do it late, right? I stopped taking off at half points. So if you don't get it done in time, please still email it to me. Some points are better than none. The last thing I want to say is I hope you all have a fantastic week next week. I would tell you not to eat too much, but I don't plan to follow that advice. So I hope you just have a nice, safe like Thanksgiving break, that it's a nice rest and like you're ready to go. When we come back, we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 classes when we come back. So that's wild, right? But we'll enjoy the time we have left. So have a wonderful break. I'll stop there. If you have any questions about your assignment or anything, I'll hang out for a few minutes since we're done a little early. And then we'll start chapter 17 when I see you in a week or so. Okay? Stop this.